At this conference, we did have an opportunity to hear from you and talk to you about monetary policy this morning, but there's also been a lot of conversation about AI and the potential impact on the economy of AI, but also the cybersecurity risks associated with new AI tools. And of course, most recently, the one we've been hearing about, worrying about, is Mythos. Can I just confirm, have UK banks got access to Mythos now? Are they getting it on that trial basis?
So they don't have access to Mythos at the moment, and that's an issue that is very important. And by the way, this is a very important development. But there are other models out there. I mean, Mythos isn't the only model out there. There's obviously something of a race going along to move the technology on. And I'm very optimistic that they either just have or are about to get, the major UK banks have access to other models which will get them substantially.
But just going back to the Mythos, sorry, because we had a story, in fact, I think the Anthropic's UK and Northern Europe's head, the company that obviously makes Mythos, they told Bloomberg last month that it would be within a week that UK bank chiefs were going to be able to be part of that, the Glass Wing project. So do you know what happened?
Well, there was so there has been a Glasswing Phase 2 being talked about really for the last 6 weeks or so, but it hasn't happened yet. And I think this has been somewhat caught up in the process with the US administration.
So, sorry, just reading between the lines, it sounds like Anthropic had certainly told us on Bloomberg Television that it was going to be just a matter of days or a week or so, and it's the US administration that has potentially
Well, we're not party to that process. I think, to be fair to Anthropic, I think they have been working very hard. They want access to critical parties, and it's very important. They're still, I think, actively seeking that. Quite why the process is a bit different from one company to another, I'm afraid I can't explain to you. Obviously, from our point of view, given our concern about the risks involved in this, it's very important that there is access. And what I really want to see is evolve a process very quickly where we can have a sort of controlled but fast process to assess these models. And frankly, as to what my head of IT at the Bank of England told me is a ton of patching that then has to follow very quickly to fix the things that these models are finding.
And I guess, as part of this conversation, I guess we also think about, one of the conversations I have when I get nervous is when they also talk about the open source, the companies that are a bit behind, the way they get users is to have open source, which means if you discover that the so-called bad guys are using that technology to rob banks or whatever it is, you're then not able to turn it off in the way you can with the others.
Well, look, I'm not speaking as an expert in this subject. I honestly
having to be an
have
expert.
to hold we try to learn quickly. Yeah. I think two things that I've taken from the many discussions we've had. One is that I think if you have kept your cyber defences up and better prepared, you will go into this process in a better place than if you haven't. And we've worked very hard with UK banks over many years, and we'll go on doing so. Secondly, I think you're right on the open source point. Now, I think what Anthropic are certainly saying is, look, open source is more of a vulnerability than closed, and that's certainly a conclusion they've drawn from all the work they've done. Now, I mean, the two things I think, however, follow. One is there's a lot of open source out there. Two, again, I'm not an expert in this field. There's a lot of almost theological, doctrine about open source and not open source, which this is somewhat pushing against. So
yeah, I think because we've tended to say there's been a sort of inclination towards open source, but in this case, it feels like it's more.
It's being questioned.
I mean, does it highlight sort of overall the risks of? I mean, going back to the Anthropic thing of having US-owned companies being absolutely dominant in this space, and actually UK banks, you being in the position of kind of begging to the Americans to get access to it?
Well, look, I don't take a particular position on where the sort of, in a sense, the companies are based that are developing these things, because this is a very, very big development, and it's actually very important, and there are many good things that will come out of this. What I would say is that the spillovers from this sort of some cyber risk are so big that we can't just have a single sort of national approach towards dealing with the consequences and mitigating it. There's got to be an international approach to this. It's got to be a sensible, sort of firmly based international process, because I think anybody who thought, well, I've dealt with my banks, that's okay, I'm afraid that won't work, because they're all so heavily interconnected. We've got big payment systems, big messaging systems. So that approach won't work.
Now, as chairman of the Financial Stability Board, you're obviously involved in lots of discussions around sort of global efforts on financial stability and looking for risks. And one area, again, where people are looking nervously at the US in particular is the run-up in private credit. And whether there should be more of a sort of a tougher approach to at least having more reporting requirements or other things on private credit. You've highlighted that a lot of traditional banks and institutions are now very much intertwined with private credit. Is that, I mean, are you getting a hearing on that from the US in terms of the risks of that?
Excuse me, yes. I think, look, first of all, private credit is playing an important role. I think it's a good thing. Let's come back to AI for a moment. We've got a very big investment demand going on for it to support the innovation in AI and in the tech sector more broadly, and private credit is an important part of meeting that demand, and that's a good thing. What I think we have to look very carefully at is the word private can be misleading in some ways because it is not an island on its own. It is connected into the system, into the broader system. A lot of the underpinning liquidity will come from the banking system. It is connected into the banking system. That's not bad. That's inevitable. So it's very important that we understand those interconnections, how they work. Are there points of sort of fragility in there? That's why at the Bank of England we're doing a second system-wide exploratory scenario to follow on the one we did on hedge fund activity and major government bond markets a couple of years ago. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think is important is, and I think this is particularly true with the spread into sort of so-called retail investment, is do the investors understand the assets they've got and the characteristics of those assets? Because there are clearly, there are some signs of strains in the market. I think they're often described as idiosyncratic. Okay, every incident will have a different story attached to it. But we are seeing some increase in requests, quite a big increase in requests for outflows to take liquidity out. And I think how that plays out will depend on what investors think they, think or thought they had relative to what they sort of now think they've got.
Just to run through in another area where you've got quite a big distinction now between the UK and the US, or at least there has been in the proposals you had put forward, was for stable coins and the basic approach you'd had towards them. Are you now scrapping the idea of capping the amount of stable coin that individuals and businesses can hold?
Well, we've looked again at that for the UK, and we'll be coming out with our proposals shortly, before the summer.
So it's still, because it was supposed to be in June.
Yeah,
June.
I'm expecting before the sort of summer holiday season takes off for us, we'll get that out. If you don't mind,
are you looking at looking at total issuance sort of limits instead of?
That would certainly be an option. Let's see where we get to. I think the other thing that I would emphasise with stable coins is to put the global hat back on again, is that we are going to have sort of what I call sort of rules of the game, as it were, for the use of stable coins cross-border. And we are going to be approaching the point when we really do need to sort of get seriously to work on that side of things, because that's going to be important. Because again, what I always say, what we want to get the benefit of is digital technology and all the benefits that will bring with it in the payment system. Now, you can do that in all sorts of ways. You can do it through central bank digital currency, you can do it through tokenized deposits, do it through stable coins. I don't think we should be in any sense sort of biased in our approach to that. But there are going to have to be sort of rules of the road, as it were.
But you've been saying something similar to that in various ways, for a while.
Yes.
And it doesn't seem like there's any appetite on the other side of the Atlantic to have rules of the road or really very many limits on this part of the market at all. They see it as a big competitive advantage for the US.
Yes, but I think the rest of the world is going to take a different view on that.
And on the the central bank digital currency, again, the US has now gone out of its way to ban, in the Genius Act, to ban the US, the Federal Reserve, from producing a digital dollar.
A retail, yes.
Will there ever be a Bank of England, will be a digital pound?
Well, we're continuing to work on it, and it's very important we do, because it helps us to understand the underlying technology. For me, I know I'm probably at the sort of noted sceptical end on this distribution. I think that for me the question is this: do we need to create a new form of central bank money to satisfy this need to have digital technology in the payment system? And look, this is a point we've discussed with the UK banks. Said, look, most of the stock of money is in your accounts. If you think about commercial bank money, they've got most of the money. There's a stock of it in the central bank. So I would say the natural starting point here is to explore the tokenized deposits. That is what is going on, both domestically and internationally. UK banks are looking at it because we got ahead in the UK 20 years ago with faster payments. Technology's moved on. We've got to move on. And then internationally, you may have seen the other day, there was news of a test of the so-called Project Agora, which the BIS are running, which we're involved in, which I think is a very good thing, because that gets to the other big issue, which is how can we improve cross-border payments? Because I'm afraid I always describe that as somewhat of the land that time forgot.
I'm pushing you because there's one last question.
Yeah,
we've had quite a lot of the central bankers here have been sort of somewhat bragging about the number of AI tools they have on their own computers and how they're using it. We're obviously using AI. Our economist team are using AI on what the Bank of England says, and we're judging whether or not it's direction of travel. How are you using it internally?
We do. So we're growing in our use of it. We use it obviously for data. Data. We use it for coding, speeding things up. But we do use it in the MPC. We've experimented with our staff have with modelling, and also we do start to use it to use things like language models to say, well, if you write the MPC minutes like this, how might it be received?
So this is terrible. So we're now going to have a sort of spiral because we are using it. We have
we know Bank you're of England using it. So,
We have developed our own. The economists have developed their own.
We've noted that.
Right.
Yes.
So we've done ours. You've done yours. The whole thing is going into an AI
our model
spiral.
can play against your model.
All right.
Well, that's the way of the world. That's the way of the world. But it's helpful to us because it does occasionally throw things up, and it says, look, if you do this, this is words, this is not about voting or anything. This is about words. This is how it will be received.
Yeah, Governor Bailey.
Is that what you want?
All right,
really
thank
good
you.
Talk to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much.